Welcome to our channel Enjoyment and Creativity. Today we're going to see the animated moral and life lesson story. Let's start. The Wisdom Tree. Let's get into the story. The village of Sundarpur sat nestled between rolling green hills and a crystal-clear river. Life here moved at a gentle pace, untouched by the chaos of the cities. The villagers believed in traditions passed down through generations, relying on the wisdom of their elders for guidance. Among them was Dadaji, a man in his late 70s, known for his patience, knowledge, and the countless stories he shared under the ancient banyan tree at the heart of the village. To the elders, he was a guiding light. To the children, he was a storyteller. But to his grandson Arav, he was just an old man stuck in the past. Arav, in his early 20s, was ambitious and restless. Unlike most villagers, he had received a modern education in the city. He admired technology, development, and modern lifestyles. Every time he saw his grandfather sitting under the banyan tree, surrounded by villagers seeking advice, he sighed in frustration. Why do people listen to him? Arav often wondered. These old traditions are holding us back. We need change. One evening, after returning from a visit to a nearby town, Arav burst into the courtyard where Dadaji was sipping herbal tea. Dadaji, do you know how far behind we are? Arav exclaimed. Other villages are growing using modern techniques. But here, we still follow your old ways. We need roads, factories, and new businesses. Dadaji smiled, setting his cup down. Development is good, Beta. But without wisdom, it can destroy more than it builds. Arav frowned. You always say that, but look at the city, they are successful. Dadaji chuckled. A tree that forgets its roots cannot stand for long. Arav shook his head. He didn't want to argue, but deep inside, he was determined to prove that modern thinking was the way forward. A tempting offer. The next day, a wealthy businessman named Mr. Mehta arrived in Sundarpur with a group of assistants. He dressed in a crisp suit and carried an air of authority. At a village gathering, he spoke about transforming Sundarpur into a prosperous town. My friends, your village has great potential, he declared. Imagine better roads, new jobs, and a bustling marketplace. I want to build a factory here, which will bring you wealth and progress. The villagers exchanged whispers. Some were excited, but the elders, including Dadaji, remained silent. Mr. Mehta continued. You only need to sell a small portion of your land. In return, I will bring modern development. Arav's eyes lit up. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for. He immediately stood up. This is exactly what we need. We can't live in the past forever. Dadaji, however, remained calm. Mr. Mehta, what will happen to our fields, our river, and our traditions if we sell our land? Mr. Mehta smiled. Respected elder, change is necessary. The world is moving forward. Dadaji nodded but didn't respond. He simply watched as the younger villagers, led by Arav, eagerly embraced the businessman's plans. That night, Dadaji sat under the banyan tree, deep in thought. The stars above twinkled like the wisdom of past generations, and he wondered if the village was about to make a mistake it would regret. The next morning, Sundarpur buzzed with excitement. The younger villagers, led by Arav, discussed plans for the new factory. Many saw it as an opportunity for jobs, better living conditions, and modern comforts. Arav stood in the village square, speaking passionately. This is our chance to bring Sundarpur into the future. We have to move forward, and for that, we must accept change. Many nodded in agreement. But amidst the excitement, the elders remained silent. They had seen outsiders make promises before. Some had been kept, but many had not. Dadaji sat under the banyan tree, listening quietly. When Arav finished speaking, he finally stood up. My dear villagers, he said in his calm voice, change is not wrong, But wisdom is knowing which changes are truly good for us. Have we asked the right questions? What will happen to our land, our water, our people if this factory is built? A young man, Ravi, frowned. But Dadaji, Mr. Mehta said we will get jobs. Dadaji nodded. Yes, but will they be jobs that respect our way of life? Or will they force us to become dependent on outsiders? Arav sighed in frustration. Dadaji, why do you always doubt everything new? You are afraid of change. Dadaji smiled. No, Beta. I am not afraid of change. I am afraid of blind change. Despite Dadaji's concerns, the villagers were eager. Mr. Mehta took advantage of their excitement. He began handing out contracts to those willing to sell their land. Arav was the first to sign, and soon many followed. Only a few families, mainly the elders, refused.
Dadaji watched with a heavy heart. He knew that once the land was sold, there would be no turning back. The warning, a week later, construction began. Large machines arrived, trees were cut down, and parts of the village's farmland were dug up. Dust filled the air, and the peaceful sounds of nature were replaced by the noise of trucks and workers. At first, Arav felt proud. This is progress, he told himself, but soon problems started appearing. The village's main well, which had provided water for generations, began to dry up. The factory's construction had disturbed the underground water sources. The river, once clear and fresh, became polluted with waste. Farmers who had not sold their land struggled to grow crops due to the lack of clean water. Worse still, the factory was hiring only a few villagers. Most of the jobs were given to outsiders who had more experience. The villagers, who had expected prosperity, now faced hardship. Arav began to feel uneasy, but his pride stopped him from admitting his mistake. Instead, he blamed the elders. If everyone had supported this, we would have had more power to negotiate, he told his friends. It's the old ways that are slowing us down. But deep inside, he could not ignore the truth. The village was suffering, and the elders had been right. One evening, he found Dadaji sitting by the dried-up well, his fingers tracing the rim. You were waiting for this, weren't you? Arav said bitterly. You wanted to prove me wrong. Dadaji shook his head. No, Beta. I wanted to protect our village. He looked around. Do you see now? Progress without wisdom leads to destruction. Arav clenched his fists. He didn't want to hear it. He had believed in the factory, and now it was failing. But what could he do? He had already made his choice. As night fell, he sat under the banyan tree, the very place where Dadaji had warned him. For the first time, doubt crept into his heart. Had he led the village into disaster? The once thriving village of Sundarpur was now struggling. The factory, which had promised prosperity, had instead brought problems that no one had foreseen, except for the elders. The river had become polluted with chemical waste, and the fish that many villagers relied on for food had disappeared. The well had dried up, forcing families to travel long distances for water. Crops wilted in the fields, and those who had sold their land now had no way to farm. The worst part was that the jobs promised by Mr. Mehta had not materialized. The factory had hired only a handful of locals, while the rest were outsiders. Many villagers who had sold their land now found themselves without work, without money, and without food. Arav watched in horror as families struggled. The people who had once supported him now looked at him with anger and disappointment. This is all your fault, Ravi accused one evening. You convinced us to trust Mr. Mehta, and now look at our village. Arav had no answer. His pride had led him to ignore the warnings of his grandfather and the elders. Now, everything was falling apart. Dadaji's journal. One evening, feeling lost and ashamed, Arav wandered into his grandfather's small room. Dadaji was asleep, but on the wooden table beside him lay an old, worn-out journal. Curious, Arav picked it up and flipped through the pages. It was filled with stories, wisdom, and lessons from past generations. Some pages contained proverbs. A river that loses its source will run dry. Gold is valuable, but wisdom is priceless. Those who forget their roots will one day lose their way. Arav swallowed hard. He had dismissed these words as outdated nonsense. But now, as he looked around at the suffering in the village, he realized how true they were.
He continued reading and found a passage about a time when Sundarpur had faced a similar crisis. Many years ago, another businessman had come with big promises. The elders of that time had resisted, protecting the village from destruction. Tears welled up in Arav's eyes. He had ignored history and made the same mistake. At that moment, Dadaji stirred in his sleep. His eyes fluttered open, and he saw Arav holding the journal. "You finally decided to listen," Dadaji said softly. Arav fell to his knees. "Dadaji, I was wrong. I was so wrong. I didn't understand. Please help me fix this." Dadaji sighed but placed a gentle hand on his grandson's shoulder. "Wisdom is not never making mistakes, Beta. It is learning from them." A plan to save the village. With renewed determination, Arav and Dadaji called for a village meeting. This time, he stood not as a leader of blind progress, but as a young man seeking wisdom. "We made a mistake," Arav admitted. "I made a mistake, but it's not too late to fix it." The villagers listened. Many were still angry, but they also knew that anger alone would not save them. Dadaji spoke next. "This village has survived for generations because of knowledge passed down by our elders. If we wish to save our home, we must use that wisdom once again." Arav turned to the elders. "You have seen challenges like this before. Please guide us." For the first time in months, hope flickered in the eyes of the villagers. The elders shared their knowledge: how to purify water naturally, how to revive dying land, and most importantly, how to outsmart Mr. Mehta and reclaim their village. The battle to save Sundarpur had begun. The next morning, Sundarpur awakened with newfound determination. The elders had devised a plan, and under Dadaji's guidance, the villagers prepared to reclaim their land, water, and dignity. Arav, now humbled, worked tirelessly. He met with families who had suffered because of the factory, apologized sincerely, and convinced them to unite for a solution. Restoring the land and water. The first step was to revive the village's water supply. The elders taught the younger generation ancient rainwater harvesting techniques. They dug small ponds, redirected rain channels, and built filtration pits using sand and charcoal. Within weeks, the wells showed signs of replenishing. The polluted river was another challenge. The elders instructed them to plant trees and certain aquatic plants along the banks to absorb toxins. The villagers also blocked the waste pipes from the factory using eco-friendly barriers. Slowly, the river began to clear. For the fields, they used traditional organic farming methods, enriching the soil with natural fertilizers. Crops started growing again, proving that the wisdom of the past still held value. Outsmarting Mr. Mehta. While the village was healing, Dadaji and Arav focused on the bigger challenge: Mr. Mehta. The businessman had tricked the villagers into signing contracts, but the elders suspected there were legal loopholes. Arav and his friend Ravi traveled to the nearby town and consulted a retired lawyer, an old friend of Dadaji. After studying the agreements, the lawyer confirmed their suspicions. Many clauses were illegal, and Mr. Mehta had no right to take over common village lands. With this evidence, Arav and the villagers confronted Mr. Mehta. At a public meeting, they exposed his deception. Under pressure and with legal action looming, Mr. Mehta had no choice but to shut down the factory and leave. The village had won. Arav's apology and a new beginning. That evening, under the banyan tree, Arav stood before the elders. I was arrogant. I thought modern ideas were superior, but I failed to see the wisdom in your teachings. I now understand that true progress comes from respecting our roots. Dadaji smiled proudly. You have learned the greatest lesson of all, Beta. The past and future must walk hand in hand. The villagers cheered. Sundarpur had not only survived, but had grown stronger. That night, a grand festival was held, celebrating both tradition and progress. The banyan tree stood tall, a silent witness to the village's journey, a reminder that the wisdom of elders was not a burden, but a guiding light. The sun rose over Sundarpur, casting golden light on the rejuvenated village. The river now flowed clear, the fields were green again, and the people, once divided by greed and doubt, stood united in harmony. Under the ancient banyan tree, the villagers gathered for a special ceremony. Arav, once blinded by arrogance, now stood humbly before them. Dadaji, with his gentle smile, placed a reassuring hand on Arav's shoulder. Wisdom is like this banyan tree, Beta. It takes years to grow, but once its roots are deep, it can withstand any storm. Arav turned to the crowd. I was wrong to dismiss the wisdom of our elders. I thought progress meant forgetting the past, but now I know that true progress comes from balancing knowledge and tradition. The villagers nodded in agreement. The young had learned from the old, and together, they had built something stronger than before. As a symbol of their renewed respect for their heritage, the villagers planted new trees along the riverbank, ensuring future generations would never forget the lessons they had learned. That evening, the village celebrated with music, food, and laughter. The banyan tree, standing tall in the moonlight, seemed to whisper the timeless truth. Elders are not just keepers of the past. They are the guiding lights of the future. Thanks for watching. Let's meet again with another interesting story. Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel.